Welcome to Wisdom Planet, wisdom worth spreading. Happy listening. The book I am sharing with you today is called The Courage to be Disliked. It is a book where one genius interprets another genius. The first genius is the author of this book, Ichiro Kishimi. He is a highly influential philosopher in Japan. At the age of 30, Kishimi encountered the teachings of another genius, Adlerian psychology, and since then, he has devoted himself wholeheartedly to the study of Adlerian thought. This book, The Courage to be Disliked, introduces the results of Kishimi's research on Adlerian psychology. Alfred Adler. He is an Austrian psychologist. He was a contemporary of Sigmund Freud and was initially a follower of Freud's ideas. However, he later became the first person to oppose Freud's theoretical system, and they went their separate ways due to their differing views. In simple terms, Freud believed that your current situation is influenced by your past experiences, your environment, and the people around you. But Adler disagreed with this and believed that your current situation is solely related to yourself. Adler established his own school of thought called individual psychology. After reading this book, I have a strong feeling that Adler's thoughts are very suitable for our current era. In this era, whether it is technology or ideas, the speed of updates and iterations is too fast. To a large extent, you need to have the ability to continuously climb in your own track. For example, we often see many young and talented individuals who achieve great success and enjoy high honors at a young age. However, it is difficult for them to sustain such achievements. This is because once they are no longer surrounded by flowers and applause, they often cannot accept it. They have not established a complete internal self-esteem system. And Adler's thoughts will tell you that your success and happiness have nothing to do with anyone else, everything depends on yourself. Adler's thoughts will help you establish this internal self-esteem system. At first listen, you might think that this sounds like a motivational speech. But it really isn't. Unlike motivational speeches, which may sound reasonable at first but lack logic and practicality upon closer examination, Adlerian psychology is not just empty words. It is based on a rigorous logical deduction. The conclusions drawn from it not only make sense when you hear them, but also withstand careful scrutiny and debate with others. Not only that, in this book, Ichiro Kishi also adopts a form similar to philosophical classics such as Analects and the Republic dialogue. The entire book consists of dialogues between a young person and a philosopher, with the young person asking questions and the philosopher answering them. Kishi chose this form to present Adler's thoughts because it is easy to understand, but more importantly, he wants to tell us that Adler's thoughts not only belong to the field of clinical psychology, but he is also a thinker and philosopher. This book discusses more philosophical issues. Next, I will divide this book into two parts to share with you. The first part discusses the reasons why we feel unhappy. The second part talks about how to have the so-called courage to be disliked. According to Adler, it is about finding that state of freedom and happiness. Okay, let's move on to the first part. According to Adler, whose fault is our misfortune? Where does all our troubles originate from? Before answering this question, it is necessary to first talk about one core idea of Adler, which is that you can make your own choices. Specifically, your life is not given to you by others, but chosen by yourself. Your choices are unrelated to anyone else and are also unrelated to past experiences. This is the fundamental difference between Adler and Freud. For example, in this book, the author mentions a female student who is troubled by a fear of facing people. Whenever she is in front of others, her face turns red. She says that she wants to cure this fear of blushing no matter what. The philosopher asks her, if this fear of blushing is cured, what would you like to do? The girl replies that there is a boy she really likes and wants to pursue a relationship with, but because of her blushing problem, she has been too afraid to confess her feelings. The girl also expresses that once her fear of blushing is cured, she will immediately confess to him. Upon hearing this, I guess your initial reaction might be, how could this girl have such misfortune and who is responsible for it? Perhaps she experienced humiliation from her parents since childhood, leading to fear of strangers, or maybe she has suffered severe emotional damage in a romantic relationship? If you think so, Freud would agree with your viewpoint. It seems reasonable to use past experiences, especially childhood psychological traumas, to explain present misfortunes. However, Adler disagrees. Adler says that if we solely rely on past reasons to explain things, we will fall into an absolute judgment. Our present and even future are entirely determined by past experiences and cannot be changed at all. This viewpoint is called causal determinism. In contrast to causal determinism, Adler advocates for a teleological perspective. Teleology would say that the reason why girls suffer from facial blushing syndrome and can't seem to be cured is not because they haven't found the right treatment, but because it is their own choice. How can this be explained? According to Adler, the thing that girls are most afraid of and want to avoid is being rejected by someone they like, and the blow and self-denial that can come from heartbreak. However, as long as facial blushing syndrome exists, she will think, the reason why I can't date him is because of this facial blushing syndrome. This way, she doesn't have to gather the courage to confess her feelings, and even if she is rejected, she can convince herself otherwise. What's more important is that she can hold on to thoughts like, if my fear of blushing is cured, I can also have love and continue living in fantasies. Of course, this blushing phobia is not something she imagined, it is a real condition, but it is still the girl's own choice. Through this example, let's briefly review Adler's core idea. Adler said that the reason you are unhappy now is because you have chosen unhappiness for yourself. The reason you cannot change is because you have made a decision to not change yourself. Here's another phenomenon that we are all familiar with: inferiority complex. It describes the negative emotional experience that arises from underestimating oneself when comparing with others. By the way, the first person to explain inferiority complex in this way was Adler. Adler used the German language, and in German, this word also means feeling of inferiority. It is a term related to self-worth judgment, the feeling of having no value and feeling insignificant. In Adler's view, everyone actually has feelings of inferiority. However, feelings of inferiority are not necessarily a bad thing. Why is that? Adler says that as human beings, we exist as powerless beings in this world. Everyone hopes to escape this state of powerlessness, so everyone strives for superiority and desires progress. Toddlers learning to stand are pursuing superiority, they learn language to communicate with others, also pursuing superiority. The continuous progress of science throughout human history is also a result of pursuing superiority. It can be said that inferiority complex is a driving force for people to constantly pursue excellence. Inferiority complex constantly makes people feel inadequate, thus motivating them to strive for improvement. However, as you can imagine, in life, we also encounter many people who become particularly negative due to their inferiority complex. They do nothing and simply conclude that they are incapable, making it extremely difficult for them to change. What is going on here? Adler says that in this situation, it should not be called inferiority complex, but rather inferiority syndrome. The inferiority complex refers to the tendency of some individuals to use feelings of inferiority as an excuse. For example, thoughts like I can't find a partner because I'm not attractive, or I can't succeed because I have a low education level. This kind of conclusion that loudly proclaims I can't do because of it goes beyond the scope of inferiority feelings and becomes an inferiority complex. Furthermore, Adler emphasizes that this inferiority complex is a choice made by oneself. You may wonder why some people choose to have an inferiority complex as their protective shield. In a nutshell, it is because they want to avoid getting hurt in their relationships with others. According to Adler, interpersonal relationships are the root cause of all troubles and negative emotions. Why? Just imagine, if someone wants to achieve the goal of not getting hurt in a relationship, what would most people do? It's quite simple, they would just become someone who only focuses on their own flaws and tries to avoid getting involved in interpersonal relationships. By doing so, they can minimize their interactions with others as much as possible. In case they face rejection or harm from others, they can console themselves with the reason that it happened because of their flaws. They believe that if they didn't have these flaws, they would be more likable. It can be said that as long as someone chooses to use their misfortune as a weapon, they will always need this misfortune. In addition to feelings of inferiority, there is another common psychological issue caused by interpersonal relationships, known as the superiority complex. It refers to constantly comparing oneself to others and fully showcasing one's superiority. These individuals actually want to use others' misfortunes to demonstrate their specialness. They always strive to outdo others in everything. Are these people happy? Of course not. As long as they feel that someone has surpassed them, they will feel anxious and uneasy, and may even resort to any means to regain their sense of superiority. You see, anyone who is part of this complex social network will feel troubled. That's why Adler said, people's troubles all come from interpersonal relationships. If you want to eliminate troubles, perhaps the only way is for a person to live alone in the universe. The above is the content of the first part. Adler believes that all troubles come from interpersonal relationships. What determines our current situation is not past experiences, but the meaning we give to those experiences. Your current situation is all your own choice. From this perspective, Adler's psychology is also a psychology of courage. If you are someone who is striving to overcome challenges, if you are someone who is not satisfied with the status quo and is striving to climb another peak in life, you need the courage to actively give meaning to past experiences, the courage to actively choose change, and the courage to be disliked in various relationships. In the next part, let's talk specifically about how to obtain this courage to be disliked and how to find a state of freedom and happiness. Starting from the viewpoint that all troubles come from interpersonal relationships, Adler believes that each of us faces three major life issues: work issues, friendship issues, and love issues. At first glance, you might say that these three major issues are inseparable from our complex social network. Does that mean that in order to handle these three major issues well, we need to invest a lot of effort in others and strive to maintain the relationships around us? Of course not. Adler said that to handle these three major issues, we rely not on others but on ourselves. Adler wants to help us establish a complete system of self-esteem from within. The establishment of this system requires concrete actions and, more importantly, psychological development. Let's start with the practical level. Let's begin with a common phenomenon: a child who doesn't like to study, doesn't pay attention in class, doesn't do homework properly, and only knows how to play games all day long. If you were a parent, what would you do? In most cases, you would probably try every possible means to make them study. Enroll them in tutoring classes, hire a private tutor, and sometimes resort to disciplinary measures if they don't complete their homework. However, as you can imagine, these coercive methods rarely make a child genuinely develop a love for learning. Of course, there are also parents who focus on guiding their child's interest in learning. But from Adler's perspective, this is not important. What you should first consider is not how to make children study, but rather, whose issue is it whether or not children study. Learning is the child's own issue, and in contrast, parents commanding children to study is an unwarranted interference in someone else's issue. This inevitably leads to conflicts. We must distinguish our own issues from those of others. We mentioned earlier that Adler said all troubles come from interpersonal relationships. Here we can go further. The troubles caused by interpersonal relationships actually stem from excessive interference in other people's issues or one's own issues being interfered with by others. As long as we can separate the issues, interpersonal relationships will undergo significant changes. Speaking of this, you may still disagree. It should be the responsibility and duty of parents to make children study, or at least it should be a shared issue between parents and children. How could it be a matter of interfering with others? In fact, it's quite simple. When determining whose issue it is, you just need to consider one thing: who will ultimately bear the consequences of this choice. If the child chooses not to study, the consequences of this decision, such as poor grades or not getting into a good school, will be borne by the child themselves, not the parents. Therefore, studying is the child's own issue. But it should be noted that this does not mean that Adler's psychology advocates permissiveness. Permissiveness is an attitude of not knowing or not wanting to know what children are doing. Adler's thinking is not permissiveness. Adler advocates protecting children based on understanding what they are doing. Parents should always be prepared to provide sufficient support to their children. Refrain from interfering when the child does not seek help from you. This is called topic separation, where you need to differentiate between the topic of helping your child succeed and the topic of your child's own learning. Topic separation is an important aspect of establishing an internal self-esteem system and also serves as a specific action guide. After discussing the behavioral aspect, let me now examine how to establish a stable internal self-esteem system at the psychological level. We all know that as social animals, humans naturally seek recognition. No one likes to be criticized or disliked by others. We can conduct a thought experiment, starting from the human nature of seeking recognition and avoiding rejection. How can we avoid being disliked by anyone? There can only be one most effective answer, which is to constantly monitor others' reactions and show loyalty to everyone you come into contact with. If there are 10 people around you, make a promise to all of them: I will strive to make you satisfied. But please note, there is a major contradiction waiting for you. Because you don't want to be disliked, you will express loyalty to these 10 people. However, the reality is often that no one can satisfy everyone. This kind of promise will soon be exposed, resulting in loss of credibility and increased pain for yourself. In conclusion, living to meet others' expectations and entrusting your life to others is being irresponsible to the people around you and to yourself. On the contrary, Adlerian psychology denies the pursuit of others' approval. Adler says that it is the pursuit of others' approval that stifles your freedom. We do not live to satisfy others' expectations, and others do not live to satisfy your expectations. If you constantly seek approval and care about others' evaluations, you will ultimately live in someone else's life. So, in Adler's view, true freedom is having the courage to be disliked by others. But this does not mean that being disliked is a state we should pursue. Adler wants to tell us that being disliked is evidence of living a free life. It is a manifestation of living according to your own way. To exercise freedom, one must pay a price. And in interpersonal relationships, the price of freedom is not being accepted by others. In other words, not wanting to be disliked is my concern, but as for whether you dislike me is not my concern, that is your issue. Finally, let's talk about how Adlerian psychology views the sense of worth and happiness. Earlier, we mentioned that Adler believed that interpersonal relationships are the source of all troubles. However, Adler also said that interpersonal relationships are also the source of happiness. The happiness brought by interpersonal relationships can be either low-level happiness or high-level happiness. Low-level happiness is derived from interpersonal relationships. For example, when you were in school, if your exam scores were better than those of your classmates and you consistently ranked first, you felt happy. When you were working, if your income was higher than that of your peers, you felt happy. After having children, if your child was more outstanding than other children, you still felt happy. However, Adler said that this kind of happiness can only be considered a low-level happiness. Your happiness must be built upon the unhappiness of others. And the higher level of happiness comes from the sense of community in interpersonal relationships. This is a key point in Adlerian psychology. The author Ichiro Kashimi says that without understanding this point, one cannot understand Adlerian psychology. So, what is the sense of community? It is actually a continuous sense of contribution. Family, school, and workplace can all be communities. In the family community, your happiness comes from being needed by your family members. In the workplace community, you can create value for the company and also experience happiness. However, we often see that some people lose their spirit immediately after retirement. This is because they are no longer needed, and they suddenly lose that sense of contribution in the community, which makes them feel unhappy. On the contrary, some billionaires already possess a massive fortune that they could never spend in their lifetime, yet the majority of them continue to work tirelessly. Why do they keep working? Is it because they have greater desires? Certainly not. What they still need is to maintain a sense of contribution to society as a whole. This kind of happiness does not come from comparing oneself to others. This is what Adler called community feeling, a continuous sense of value and contribution to others. However, it is important to note that this sense of contribution is still unrelated to others. Adler opposes sacrificing oneself for the community. Adler emphasizes that this sense of happiness can also be achieved through invisible forms. The starting point and end point of your pursuit of happiness still converge on yourself. Although your contribution and value are manifested in this community, the final result is still unrelated to others, and you do not need the affirmation or reward from others. Finally, let me share my own feelings. Have you noticed that Adler's advocated ideology, if applied today, can be described more vividly as closing the loop? More precisely, it should be closing the loop within oneself. This means that your actions and thoughts should form a closed loop within yourself. For example, when you praise others, you unconsciously want them to accept your praise. When you apologize to someone, you pay special attention to whether they will forgive you. But Adler's ideology tells us that these things are not important. What matters is that you believe in your heart that doing these things is right and meaningful. Finally, the author of this book, Ichiro Kashimi, also mentioned that in order to truly understand Adler's psychology, it takes half the time of one's own age. In other words, if you start learning at the age of 40, it will take 20 years to master it. A listening time of just over 20 minutes is not enough to fully summarize Adler's philosophical thoughts. If you are also interested in this theory, you are welcome to read the original book. If you have discovered any valuable ideas from the book, please feel free to share them in the comments section. Congratulations on finishing another book. Thank you for your support. Please subscribe to our Wisdom Planet audiobook channel. Like and share it with family and friends. Wisdom worth spreading and opening up a better future. Thank you and see you again.